boy. And if you followed his career, that's probably not shocking news. Was Mel Gibson's The Passion of Christ a true reflection of Christ's life and mission? Or was it a Hollywood interpretation designed for maximum impact? We'll take a deep dive into the film's accuracy, its emotional power, and what religious experts say about Gibson's claim. Stick around because the answer may surprise you. Mel Gibson got caught up in the party scene, made questionable choices, and before he knew it, he was battling serious addiction problems. Alcohol became his crutch, and the more he drank, the more his life spiraled out of control. At one point, things got so bad that he found himself standing at the edge of a window contemplating ending it all. Can you imagine? A man with everything, money, fame, success, yet feeling so empty that he was ready to throw it all away. But then, something changed. He didn't take that to death. Instead, at 35, he had a moment of clarity, an awakening, if you will. It wasn't dramatic, like lightning flashing across the sky or angels singing in the background. It was quieter, more personal. He realized he had drifted so far from the faith that once grounded him, and he made a choice to turn back to God. And when he did, something inside him shifted. The Bible, which once seemed like just another old book, suddenly became real to him. The story of Christ's suffering wasn't just a religious tale anymore. It was something he felt deeply in his soul. He started to see it as a raw human experience, something worth digging into, something that needed to be told in a way people had never seen before. That's where the passion of the Christ began to take form. Now here's where things get a little eerie. Allegedly, one day, a book literally fell off a shelf and landed right at his feet. Not just any book, but The Dolorous Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ by Sister Anne Catherine Emmerich, a 19th century mystic who had visions of Christ's suffering. Whether it was coincidence or divine intervention, the book changed everything. It wasn't just a retelling of the Gospels. It was filled with vivid, heartbreaking details that weren't mentioned in the Bible. Scenes of Mary mopping up her son's blood and brutal moments of suffering that made the crucifixion feel even more agonizing than people typically imagine. The more Gibson read, the more he felt like he had to bring this story to life. It wasn't just an idea anymore. It became a mission. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy project. This wasn't just another Hollywood blockbuster. It was a deeply spiritual journey. He didn't want to make just another religious movie. He wanted to create something that would shake people, something that would make them see Christ's suffering in a way they had never considered before. And let's be honest, no one takes on a project this intense without preparing for it in some way. Gibson himself admitted, you can't go into a project as profound in nature as this without somehow preparing yourself for it. And prepare, he did. How did he prepare, one might ask? You would be surprised by how much preparation he put into the Passion of Christ movie. And when he was determined to show the world the real Jesus Christ, he meant it. Keep watching as I go into the nitty-gritty of how he achieved it all. Bringing ancient languages to life. How he achieved it all. Bringing ancient languages to life. Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ wasn't just another biblical movie. It was an attempt to transport audiences straight into the first century, using language as a key to authenticity. And honestly, how often do you see a Hollywood movie where the actors are speaking Aramaic? That alone set this film apart. But the decision wasn't just for show. Gibson was obsessed with making everything feel as real as possible, down to the way people would have actually spoken at the time. So instead of English, the film featured three main languages: Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew, each chosen with a very specific purpose. Aramaic, the everyday language of Jesus and his disciples, made up the bulk of the dialogue. Latin was reserved for the Romans, particularly in interactions with figures like Pontius Pilate. Hebrew appeared in religious settings, like when the Pharisees and high priests were talking amongst themselves. The goal was clear: make the world feel real, raw, and immersive. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Gibson initially wanted the film to have 0 subtitles. Can you imagine? The idea was to let the emotions, expressions, and context tell the story instead of words. What do you think about that? Well, the thought process behind this was that real life doesn't come with subtitles, and the audience would be forced to engage with the film in a more visceral way. But of course, reality set in, and he had to compromise. Subtitles were added to help viewers follow along, though the visual storytelling remained strong enough that you could still understand what even wilder. Folco had to invent certain aspects of the Aramaic dialogue because the exact dialect Jesus spoke isn't clearly documented. He pieced together a version that was as close as possible, using everything scholars knew about the language's structure, but it was still an educated approximation. So, while the film aimed for authenticity, some elements were necessarily speculative. And get this, the production team didn't stop at just translating words. They actually tweaked the way different characters spoke to reflect social differences. For example, the Roman soldiers spoke a rough, less polished version of Latin, while Pilate's Latin was more refined and aristocratic. That's a tiny detail, but it speaks volumes about the kind of meticulous thought that went into making the film as immersive as possible. Don't you agree? But of course, things weren't that simple. Translation is never a perfect science, and Folco faced a ton of challenges along the way. One of the biggest hurdles? Figuring out how characters would naturally interact in a multilingual society. In real life, not everyone in ancient Judea would have been fluent in multiple languages. So, Folco actually added mistakes into the script. Yes, intentional errors. Some characters mispronounced words or had slight grammatical inconsistencies to show that they weren't fully comfortable speaking a second or third language. It's the kind of detail most people wouldn't consciously notice, but it added another layer of realism to the film. Of course, not everyone was convinced by the film's linguistic choices. Scholars and language experts scrutinized the accuracy of the Aramaic and Latin, pointing out that some words and phrases might not have been exactly right for the time period. And that's fair. After all, language evolves. We don't have perfect records of how people spoke 2,000 years ago. Folco himself even admitted that there were compromises, explaining that certain adjustments had to be made for clarity and flow. But despite the criticisms, there's no denying that the Passion of the Christ set a new bar for historical accuracy in religious films. For years, Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ has been called the most powerful depiction of Jesus